When the city first saw the footage, it seemed to see everything. At 10:42 p.m., a man in a charcoal overcoat crossed the polished lobby of the Bellamy residencies, nodded once to the night concierge, and stepped into the elevator with the relaxed authority of someone who belonged there. At 12:17 a.m., the same man came back down alone. He moved faster on the way out. His collar was turned up, his face caught by 3 cameras, his right hand buried in his coat pocket, his left hand bare beneath the bright white ceiling lights. 40 minutes later, a neighbor on the 31st floor called 911 because a dog would not stop barking behind the door of apartment 3108. Inside, police found Elise Varden on the bedroom carpet, 29 years old, 14 weeks pregnant, and dead. She had been bludgeoned to death with an unknown object that police hadn't located at the scene. The man on the footage was identified before sunrise as Malcolm St. James, founder of St. James Meridian Capital, philanthropist, darling of financial magazines, owner of 3 homes, 2 private aircraft memberships, and a marriage that had survived mostly because his wife had stopped expecting truth from him. The affair with Elise came out by breakfast. By noon, every news outlet in the state had a photograph of Malcolm beside one of Elise, him in a tuxedo at a hospital gala, her smiling in a white summer dress at a charity auction where she had once worked the registration table. By evening, the word pregnant had become the engine of the story. Malcolm surrendered through counsel 2 days later. He wore a navy suit and no expression. Cameras pressed against the courthouse barricades. Reporters shouted questions about the baby, about the surveillance video, about whether his wife had known. Malcolm said only, "I did not kill Elise. I was framed." Then his attorney, Vivian Cross, placed a hand lightly on his elbow and guided him through the doors. The bail hearing was expected to be symbolic. Murder defendants with motive, opportunity, and a dead pregnant lover rarely walked free. But Malcolm had money, no criminal record, deep roots in the community, and a defense team that arrived with binders, investigators, and expert declarations challenging the state's timeline. Vivian Cross argued that the video proved only presence, not murder, that Elise had enemies of her own, that the prosecution had no weapon, no blood on Malcolm's clothes, no confession, no eyewitness, and no forensic evidence tying him to the fatal act. The judge, stern and visibly irritated by the circus outside, set bail at an amount that would have ruined most families for generations. Malcolm posted it before the court clerk finished processing the order. Outside the courthouse, Malcolm paused at the top of the steps as though posing for a portrait no one had asked for. Behind him stood Vivian, composed and severe. 10 feet away, his wife, Celeste, watched him with a stillness that the cameras mistook for loyalty. She was beautiful in the disciplined way of women who had learned to make elegance a shield. Cream coat, dark gloves, hair pinned low, eyes unreadable. When Malcolm reached for her hand, she let him take it. She did not squeeze back. 3 months before trial, Malcolm saw his face in a gas station CCTV monitor outside a town called Briar, where the highway narrowed into 2 lanes and the houses seemed to lean toward one another against the wind. He had not meant to stop there. He was supposed to be at a secluded lake house reviewing jury consultants' reports, but the walls had begun closing in, and his ankle monitor allowed a narrow radius Vivian had negotiated under seal. So Malcolm drove until the signal warned him to turn back. He pulled into the gas station for coffee and saw himself on the small screen above the cashier's counter, The man on the screen lifted a crate of canned peaches into the back of a pickup truck and laughed at something the gas attendant said. He was thinner than Malcolm, dressed in a faded work jacket, with a beard that looked self-cut and eyes that carried exhaustion instead of polish. But the face was Malcolm's face, the same brow, the same cheekbones, the same narrow scar through the left eyebrow from an old childhood fall, though on this man it appeared as if life itself had placed it there. "Who is that?" Malcolm asked. The cashier glanced at the screen. "Jonah Williams works over at Kale's Feed Supply when they've got hours for him. Y'all kind of favor each other. Any relation?" Malcolm did not answer. He paid for coffee he never drank and sat in his car until Jonah Williams came out of the station carrying a sack of rice, a carton of milk, and a box of children's medicine. Malcolm watched him climb into a truck with rust along the doors and a cracked windshield patched with tape. In the passenger seat, bundled beneath a pink blanket, was a little girl whose skin had the waxen pallor of someone familiar with hospitals. She smiled when Jonah opened the door. The smile transformed him. His shoulders loosened, his face softened, and for one unguarded second, he looked like a man who still believed sacrifice could buy mercy. By nightfall, Malcolm had a private investigator on the phone. By morning, Vivian Cross had a file. Jonah Williams, 38, no criminal record, widower, hourly laborer, former apprentice mechanic, father of Lila Williams, age 7. Lila had been born with a rare cardiac defect. Her mother, Mara, had died in childbirth. No grandparents living, no siblings, no trust fund, no church collection large enough, no miracle waiting in the mail. The surgery Lila needed was available, but the hospital's financial office had reduced hope to invoices and payment plans. Jonah was drowning quietly, the way poor men often drowned, not in one dramatic plunge, but by inches, with a child's hand in his. Jonah refused the first meeting. He refused the second, too. On the third attempt, Malcolm came without Vivian, without a driver, without the armor of his usual world. He found Jonah behind the feed supply after closing, loading broken pallets into a dumpster under a sky the color of old tin. Jonah turned when he heard the shoes on gravel, and the sight of the two men facing each other made the air feel briefly unreal. They were not twins. Twins shared an origin. These men looked like a clerical error in creation. "I know what people say you did," Jonah said. "People say many things," Malcolm replied. "Did you kill her?" Malcolm's gaze did not flicker. "No." Jonah looked away first. "Then why are you here?" Malcolm told him, enough to sound desperate and not enough to sound monstrous. He spoke of a prosecution built on appearances, of a life ruined by coincidence, of a legal system that loved clean narratives. He said that a man could be convicted because a camera caught him entering a building, because grief demanded a villain, because jurors believed wealth always hid corruption. Jonah listened with the guarded patience of someone who had never had the luxury of believing rich men's problems were real. Then Malcolm said Lila's name. Jonah crossed the space between them so fast, Malcolm nearly stepped back. "Don't." "Her surgery can be scheduled within 2 weeks," Malcolm said softly. "The best pediatric team, private room, full rehabilitation, caregivers you approve, every bill paid before she's admitted, and when it is done, $1 million in a trust under your control." Jonah's hands curled. "For what?" "For time," Malcolm said, for courage, for sitting where I sit. The plan, when Vivian explained it later in the back room of a closed law office, was both elegant and obscene. Jonah would become Malcolm for the duration of the trial. He would learn Malcolm's gestures, his habits, his signature, the shape of his silence. He would attend meetings with counsel, appear in court, sit beside Vivian while prosecutors pointed to him and called him a murderer. Malcolm himself would disappear into one of the private properties hidden inside layers of shell companies. Celeste would maintain the household illusion. Vivian would manage the legal machinery. No one else would know. "This is fraud," Jonah said. Vivian did not blink. "This is theater. Trials are theater with rules. And if I'm convicted, you won't be," Malcolm said, "because at the end, Vivian will reveal that the man in the chair is not Malcolm St. James. She will show the jury that if they can be wrong about the man sitting 10 feet away, they can be wrong about the man on the camera." Jonah stared at him. "You're going to use me as doubt." "I'm going to use the truth," Malcolm said. "You exist." That night, Jonah sat beside Lila's hospital bed and watched her sleep through the hiss and blink of machines. She looked smaller each time he brought her in, as though the illness was stealing not only her strength, but her claim to space in the world. He thought of Mara, of the way she had made him promise, before the fever took her voice, that he would not let their daughter grow up believing love was only another word for loss. He thought of Malcolm's eyes, expensive and empty. He thought of $1 million and hated himself for how quickly the number had begun to sound like oxygen. At dawn, he called Vivian Cross and said yes. Becoming Malcolm was less a transformation than an erasure. Jonah's beard vanished first. Then his hair was cut by a stylist who spoke to him as though he were furniture. A dentist fitted temporary veneers to close a small gap Malcolm did not have. A trainer corrected his posture. A tailor measured him without asking his name. Vivian drilled him on biography until Jonah could recite board appointments, club memberships, favored wines, charitable pledges, and the names of men who would shake his hand in court and never notice the calluses beneath the manicure. Celeste was supposed to be part of the training only when necessary. Instead, she became the one person who noticed what the others ignored. Jonah did not interrupt her. He thanked the housekeeper by name. He carried his own coffee cup to the sink. When Celeste entered a room, he looked up as if her presence changed something. Malcolm had once done that years ago, before money hardened into entitlement and tenderness became a performance he gave donors at banquets. "You don't have to be kind to me," she told Jonah one evening in the library, where rain moved like fingers against the windows. He looked startled. "I wasn't aware kindness required a reason." Celeste almost laughed, but the sound caught behind her ribs. In Malcolm's house, kindness always came with an invoice. Lila's surgery took place on a Tuesday morning while Jonah sat in a mock courtroom learning how to keep his face still when prosecutors described Elise's last moments. Vivian gave him updates only during breaks. Successful incision, stable bypass, repair complete, recovery guarded but promising. Jonah went into the restroom after the final update, locked himself in a stall, pressed both fists to his mouth, and wept without sound. When he came out, Malcolm was waiting by the sinks. "Get it together," Malcolm said. "You cry like that in court. They'll think I have a conscience." Jonah looked at the man whose life he was borrowing and understood, with sudden cold certainty, that innocence and cruelty could live in the same body. He still did not know whether Malcolm had killed Elise. He only knew Malcolm would have stepped over anyone to survive. The first real threat came from a mistake no one had rehearsed. During a private strategy session, Vivian slid a folder across the table and asked Jonah to initial a discovery receipt the way Malcolm always did, with a hard downward stroke on the M and a careless slash through the tail. Jonah had practiced the signature hundreds of times, but his hand paused for half a breath. Celeste saw it. So did Vivian. Malcolm, watching from the corner of the room like a man observing a servant mishandle crystals, smiled thinly. "Again," he said. Jonah took a fresh page and signed. This time, the pen moved perfectly. Vivian kept the flawed version anyway, tucking it into her folder without explanation. After that, Jonah stopped sleeping. Every detail became a trap. Which wrist Malcolm wore his watch on, how he took his coffee, whether he called the driver Thomas or Tom, which board member had a son at Princeton and which had a daughter in rehab. Vivian hired a former theater coach to teach him stillness under scrutiny. The coach slapped the table without warning, dropped books behind him, shouted accusations inches from his face. "A guilty man reacts," she said. "A powerful man waits to see who apologizes." Jonah learned to wait. He hated how quickly he learned. 1 week before jury selection, Jonah's old life reached through the disguise. A nurse from Lila's hospital called Malcolm's private phone while Celeste was in the room. Jonah answered too quickly, forgetting the number was supposed to belong to another man. "Mr. Williams?" the nurse said. Jonah froze. Celeste turned from the window. On the other end of the line, the nurse asked whether he could approve a medication change. Jonah covered the receiver and looked at Celeste, terror plain on his borrowed face. She took the phone from him with steady hands. "This is Mrs. St. James," she said. "He authorizes it. Send the papers to me." When she ended the call, neither of them spoke for a long time. That night, Celeste found Jonah in the dark kitchen, fully dressed, one hand braced against the counter, as if the marble were the only thing keeping him upright. "I can't do this," he whispered. "I can sit in that chair. I can let them call me his name. But if I miss something with Lila because I'm pretending to be him..." His voice broke. Celeste moved closer, but did not touch him. "Then we make sure you do not miss it," she said. "And if Malcolm objects, he can explain to me which part of his life is worth more than your daughter's." It was the first time Jonah heard open contempt in her voice. It was also the first time he wondered whether she was helping him for reasons that no longer had anything to do with her husband. The trial opened under a storm of attention. The prosecution told the jury that Malcolm St. James had lived 2 lives, devoted husband in public, reckless lover in private. Elise, they said, had become inconvenient when she refused to terminate the pregnancy and threatened to expose him. The surveillance footage showed him entering her building. The timeline placed him there. His wealth gave him motive to protect reputation, marriage, business, and legacy. The defendant believed he could buy silence, the prosecutor said. When silence became impossible, he chose violence. Jonah sat at the defense table and felt every eye in the courtroom land on the borrowed shape of his face. He had been told not to react, not to flinch at Elise's photographs, not to look too long at Celeste, not to forget that cameras loved the smallest betrayal of expression. He listened as witnesses described Malcolm's affair. He watched the concierge identify him as the man who had passed through the lobby that night. He heard experts explain timestamps and angles and facial comparison. Each day, he returned to Malcolm's house more hollow than before. The concierge was the prosecution's first clean witness, a narrow man named Edwin Price, who had worked the Bellamy's front desk for 11 years and remembered residents by their shoe leather, cologne, and impatience. He pointed to Jonah without hesitation. "That is Mr. St. James," he said. The prosecutor let the certainty linger. Then she walked him through the night of Elise's death. The overcoat, the elevator, the lack of a guest sign-in because Malcolm was expected, the quick exit after midnight. Jonah kept his gaze lowered to the legal pad in front of him. He had written nothing on it except Lila's name, over and over in tiny controlled letters. On cross-examination, Vivian approached Edwin with the patience of a surgeon. "You see hundreds of faces a week, correct?" she asked. "Residents, guests, delivery personnel, contractors." Edwin agreed. She asked whether lighting changed the way cameras captured a face. He agreed. Whether a hat, weight loss, facial hair, or fatigue could affect recognition. He agreed again, laced comfortably. Then Vivian displayed a still frame from the lobby camera beside a photograph of Malcolm taken at a fundraiser. "You identified the man in the footage because you believed you already knew who you were looking at, didn't you?" Edwin's jaw tightened. "I knew him." Vivian smiled faintly. "You knew a face." The next witness was Elise's friend, Dana Cole, whose grief made the courtroom smaller. She testified that Elise had been afraid in the weeks before her death, that she had said Malcolm wanted the pregnancy handled, that she had saved messages because she no longer trusted promises made behind closed doors. The prosecutor read one aloud. "You do not get to decide whether this child exists." Jonah felt the words strike him in a place no preparation had armored. He looked up once and saw Celeste in the gallery. Her gloved hands folded so tightly the knuckles showed pale. Vivian's cross of Dana was brutal without ever raising her voice. She asked about Elise's debts, about arguments with an ex-boyfriend, about whether Elise had exaggerated before when she was frightened. Dana answered through tears but did not break. She was not exaggerating about being dead, she said. A murmur passed through the gallery. Jonah felt Vivian stiffen beside him. For the first time, the defense table seemed less like a fortress than a thin piece of furniture between him and a truth he did not want to know. During the lunch recess, Malcolm called from the hidden house on a secure line. Vivian put him on speaker in a conference room with the blinds drawn. "Dana heard us," she said. "The jury believed her." Malcolm's voice came through smooth and irritated. "Then make them stop believing her." Jonah stared at the phone. "She was her friend," he said before he could stop himself. Silence followed. Malcolm laughed once. "Careful, Jonah. You're being paid to have my face, not my opinions." Celeste reached across the table and ended the call. The medical examiner testified in the afternoon. He explained the angle of Elise's injuries, the estimated time of death, the absence of defensive wounds on the man the state believed had overpowered her. The prosecutor asked whether the victim's pregnancy had changed his conclusions. "It changed the weight of what was lost," he said. Vivian objected. The judge sustained it, but the sentence remained in the room. Jonah closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, A juror in the second row was watching him. The detective came last, broad-shouldered and careful, the kind of witness who answered only the question asked. He described obtaining the surveillance footage, confirming Malcolm's affair, searching Malcolm's car and office, and finding nothing physical that connected him to the scene. The prosecutor moved quickly past that weakness. Vivian did not. "No murder weapon?" she asked. "No." "No blood recovered from Mr. St. James's clothing?" "No." "No fingerprints inside the apartment that surprised you?" "No." "No DNA evidence placing him in physical contact with Ms. Varden at the time of death?" The detective hesitated. "No." Vivian turned toward the jury, as if the answer belonged to them now. But the detective had one blade left. On redirect, the prosecutor asked whether the investigation had uncovered anyone else with a known motive to kill Elise. "No," he said. "And did the defendant ever voluntarily provide the shoes he wore that night?" Vivian was on her feet before the question finished. The judge sustained the objection and ordered the jury to disregard it. Jonah did not know what the question meant. Celeste did. Her face changed so slightly that only someone looking for fear would have seen it. Malcolm's shoes, hidden in the wine cellar, had begun walking toward the trial without anyone yet hearing the steps. Celeste began waiting up for him. At first, she asked practical questions. Had Vivian prepared him for tomorrow? Had the prosecutor noticed anything? Did he need dinner? Later, when the house had gone quiet, their conversation shifted into dangerous honesty. Jonah told her about Mara, about Lila's laugh, about the shame of accepting Malcolm's offer. Celeste told him about the early years of her marriage, when Malcolm still pretended ambition was something they shared rather than something that consumed him. She did not tell Jonah everything, not yet. The suspense inside the house became worse than the trial. Malcolm sent instructions through Vivian, then through encrypted messages, then through Celeste's private assistant, when Vivian refused to pass along insults disguised as strategy. He wanted Jonah colder, less sympathetic, more like the man jurors expected a billionaire to be. Jonah tried. In court, he straightened his cufflinks and looked bored when witnesses cried. At night, he sat in Lila's hospital room by video call and sang the lullaby Mara used to sing, keeping his voice low so no one outside the locked study would hear the difference between Malcolm St. James and a father praying for one more morning. Celeste's secret became heavier each day. She went twice to the wine cellar and stood before the cabinet where the shoes were hidden inside a cedar box behind old Bordeaux. The first time, she only touched the lid. The second time, she opened it and saw again the faint dark crescent near the heel. She remembered Malcolm coming home before dawn, not frantic, not devastated, merely annoyed that the rain had started. She remembered him saying, "If anyone asks, I was with you." She remembered herself nodding, because fear had trained her faster than love ever had. One evening, Jonah found her there. She closed the cabinet too quickly. "What is it?" he asked. Celeste said nothing. A lie would have been easy, but Jonah had become painfully familiar with people who lied smoothly. He stepped back instead of pressing her. "Whatever it is," he said, "make sure you can live with it after this is over." He left her alone among the bottles and shadows. The sentence stayed with her longer than any accusation could have. In the third week, Vivian began building the trap. She asked the facial recognition expert whether identical twins could complicate identification. She asked the concierge how often he mistook residents for guests. She asked the lead detective whether anyone had searched for another man with Malcolm's height, build, and features. The detective said no. Vivian let the answer sit in the room like a fuse. Vivian's trap tightened around the facial recognition expert on the 18th day of testimony. The expert had mapped distances between eyes, nose, chin, and jawline, then presented percentages that sounded scientific enough to comfort frightened jurors. Vivian made him admit that the footage was grainy, that compression distorted edges, that the camera angle lengthened the face, that his software had never been designed to distinguish between unrelated lookalikes of extraordinary similarity. So your conclusion is not that the man must be Malcolm St. James, she said. Your conclusion is that the man resembles him. The expert shifted in the witness chair. Strongly resembles him. Vivian nodded. Strong resemblance is not identity. The prosecutor sensed the floor moving beneath her and changed tactics. She asked the judge to require the defendant to stand before the jury while the lobby footage played. Jonah rose. On the screen, the man in the overcoat entered the Bellamy. In the courtroom, Jonah stood beneath the fluorescent lights, with every juror comparing breath to shadow, living man to pixel. For one terrible moment, he thought the disguise would fail, not because they saw through him, but because they saw too well. The man on the screen moved with Malcolm's loose arrogance, the careless entitlement Jonah could imitate only when he hated himself most. A juror frowned. Another leaned forward. Vivian touched Jonah's sleeve, and he sat before his knees betrayed him. That night, Jonah confronted Vivian. What happens if they ask me to speak? Vivian closed her briefcase. They will not. What happens if the judge orders it? Then you say, as little as possible. And if my voice gives me away? Vivian looked at him then, not as a client or a tool, but as a man she had placed inside a machine she could not fully control. Then we find out whether doubt is stronger than disgust. The following morning, the prosecutor requested a sidebar after noticing Jonah write with his left hand. Malcolm, she said, had signed corporate documents right-handed. Vivian countered that the defendant was under no obligation to perform habits for the state. The judge denied the request, but the warning landed hard. At the defense table, Jonah folded his left hand beneath his right and kept it there until his fingers cramped. Celeste watched from the gallery, understanding that the entire deception could collapse on something as small as a pin. By closing argument, the jury looked tired and uncertain, but the courtroom itself seemed awake in a dangerous way. Reporters filled every bench not reserved for family. Deputies stood closer to the doors than they had on any previous day. Even the judge, who had spent weeks sanding emotion out of the proceedings, watched Vivian with a narrowed, expectant gaze. Jonah could feel sweat gathering beneath his collar. Celeste sat behind him with both hands clasped around her purse, where the weight of one impossible decision seemed to pull her shoulders forward. Vivian rose slowly, buttoned her jacket, and walked to the center of the courtroom with the calm of someone stepping onto thin ice by choice. The state has asked you to convict a man because a camera caught a face, she said. Not an act, not a weapon, not blood, a face. They have told you that face belongs to Malcolm St. James because they cannot imagine another explanation. She turned toward Jonah, and for one suspended second, he thought she might spare him. Then she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, The man sitting at counsel table is not Malcolm St. James. The courtroom detonated. A reporter dropped a recorder. Someone in the gallery gasped Malcolm's name, as if summoning a ghost. The prosecutor shot to her feet, face flushed. "Objection! Your Honor, this is outrageous." The judge struck the bench so hard, the sound cracked through the room. "Counsel, approach now." But Vivian did not move. "Your Honor, the jury has a right to hear why identity matters." "The jury has a right to an orderly trial," the judge snapped. Vivian placed one hand on Jonah's shoulder and said loudly enough for the jury to hear before the deputies could react. "His name is Jonah Williams. He is living proof that the state's entire case rests on an assumption." Jonah felt the room turn on him. The jurors stared as if his face had split open to reveal another man beneath it. "Remove the jury," the prosecutor demanded. "Now." Vivian stepped toward the bench, speaking in a low, urgent voice that carried anyway. "Identity is the issue. If 12 intelligent people sat here for weeks and believed this man was Malcolm St. James, then the state cannot ask them to treat a grainy image as certainty." The prosecutor pointed at Jonah. "This is fraud, not evidence." Vivian answered without looking away from the judge. "No, it is the state's blind spot made flesh." The prosecutor turned toward Jonah. "Then say your name," she snapped. Vivian spun toward her. "Do not question my client outside the rules." "Your client?" the prosecutor said. "Which one?" The gallery stirred. The judge leaned forward. "One more word from anyone not authorized to speak, and I will clear this courtroom." Jonah heard Vivian whisper, "Sit still." But the command arrived too late. The request hit harder than any accusation. Jonah, exhausted past fear, stood before anyone could stop him. His voice, when it came, was not Malcolm's trained baritone. It was rougher, poorer, marked by late shifts and hospital rooms and years of saying no to bills he could not pay. "My name is Jonah Williams," he said. "I am not Malcolm St. James, and I am not the man you charged." The prosecutor stared at him. Everyone's attention was in front of the courtroom when a voice from the courtroom door rang out. "I am Malcolm St. James." All eyes darted to the man in the expensive Italian suit walking down the aisle toward the counsel table. He bore an identical resemblance to the man already standing there, but his smile belonged to someone who expected every room to make space for him. "Your Honor," Malcolm said, spreading his hands, "I would like the record to reflect that I am present." The prosecutor whispered, "My God." Jonah said nothing. Vivian's face emptied of color. For the first time in the trial, Vivian looked afraid, not because the trick had failed, but because it had worked too well. The jurors had heard the difference. They had seen the body at the table remain the same, while the man inside it changed. The prosecutor's certainty faltered, and in that falter, Vivian saw acquittal beginning to form. Then Celeste stood. No one noticed Celeste at first. All focus was on Malcolm, on Jonah, on Vivian, on the judge demanding silence. Celeste moved down the aisle with her purse pressed to her ribs. At the swinging gate, a deputy blocked her. "Ma'am, step back." Celeste opened the purse, removed a sealed paper bag, and held it out to the prosecutor without looking away from Jonah. "I should have brought these sooner," she said. Malcolm turned sharply. "Celeste!" She did not look at him. Not this time. The prosecutor stared at the bag, then at Celeste. "What is this?" she asked. Celeste's lips parted, and for a moment no sound came. the shoes he wore that night. Vivian went still. Across the room, Jonah understood only that something had changed, that the ground beneath everyone's strategy had given way. Malcolm stepped towards Celeste, but a deputy moved between them. "You don't know what you're doing," Malcolm said. Celeste finally looked at him. "That has been true for most of our marriage. Not today." The judge ordered the jury out again, but several jurors looked back as they filed through the side door, their faces bright with the knowledge that they had just witnessed the case become something no instruction could fully erase. While Vivian fought to turn deception into doubt, Celeste sat in a small interview room 2 floors below the courtroom with the prosecutor, 2 detectives, and the sealed paper bag on the table between them. Inside was a pair of Malcolm's shoes, black leather, handmade in Italy, polished so well they reflected light like water. She had found them the morning after Elise died, hidden behind storage boxes in the wine cellar, one sole faintly marked with something rust-colored lodged near the heel. Malcolm had told her to forget she saw them. For months she had tried. Now, above her, the courthouse still trembled from Vivian's revelation, and Celeste understood that silence had become its own kind of testimony. She had not protected Malcolm because she believed him innocent. She had protected him because fear can look like loyalty from a distance. But Jonah's presence had changed the shape of her silence. He had carried another man's guilt to save his daughter. Celeste had carried her husband's guilt to save herself from the ruin of admitting what she had married. One sacrifice had love at its center, the other had cowardice. "Test them," Celeste said. Her voice shook, but she did not take the bag back. "And if you need me to say it under oath, I will." The prosecutor studied her carefully. "Mrs. St. James, do you understand what you're alleging?" Celeste looked at the sealed bag, as if it had been breathing in the dark for months. "I understand what I helped hide." One detective leaned forward. "Did your husband tell you to conceal them?" Celeste closed her eyes once. "He told me to forget. I mistook that for an order." The results came back as the courthouse prepared for what everyone believed would be the final fatal blow to the prosecution. Elise Varden's blood was embedded in the stitching near the heel. Beneath it, in a partial mixture recovered from the inner sole, was Malcolm's DNA. Not Jonah's, Malcolm's. The prosecution moved to reopen evidence before the jury could be charged and argued that Malcolm should be detained. Vivian objected with fury, then calculation, then something close to panic. "This is trial by surprise," she argued. "This is prejudice dressed as science." The prosecutor answered, "No, Miss Cross, this is the evidence your client buried." The judge listened, jaw tight. Truth does not become inadmissible simply because it arrived late, he ruled. When Malcolm was brought into court the next morning under guard, the illusion died completely. He had shaved badly. His expensive calm was gone, replaced by a thin, furious brightness in his eyes. The gallery erupted at the sight of the real man beside the false one. "Order," the judge thundered. Jonah remained seated, hands folded, while Malcolm was placed at the defense table. Like evidence, no one could deny. For one astonishing moment, the two men faced each other across the same space. Mirror and accusation, bargain and buyer. Malcolm leaned close enough for only Jonah to hear. "You were supposed to disappear." Jonah looked at him. So was she. Jonah cut his eyes back at Celeste so that Malcolm would look at her. "You did this," Malcolm said to Celeste, loud enough for the front row to hear. Celeste rose slowly. "No," she said. "You did." The judge threatened to clear the courtroom. The prosecutor did not raise her voice when the jury returned. She did not need to. She placed the shoes on the evidence table in full view, and the black leather seemed to absorb every light in the room. "Tell the jury what you found," she said. A forensic analyst explained the blood, the stitching, the DNA mixture, the probability that the profile belonged to Malcolm St. James and not to the man who had worn his life like a borrowed coat. Vivian rose for cross-examination. "You cannot say when that blood was deposited, can you?" "No," the analyst said. "But I can say whose blood it is." Vivian's mouth tightened. "And DNA can transfer." "It can," the analyst replied. A ripple moved through the gallery before the judge silenced it. The defense had asked the jury to doubt faces. The state now asked them to trust blood. Malcolm leaned toward Vivian as the analyst stepped down. "Fix it," he hissed. Vivian looked at him, and whatever loyalty money had purchased finally reached its limit. "I already did," she said. "You just kept bleeding through." The verdict came after 6 hours that felt less like deliberation than punishment. When the jury returned, Malcolm stood as if posture alone could command history to correct itself. Jonah stood too, though no one had asked him. Celeste remained seated until the foreperson unfolded the paper. The clerk asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson answered, "We have." Malcolm whispered, "Look at me, Celeste." She did not. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Malcolm St. James, guilty." The word moved through the courtroom like a door slamming shut. Malcolm turned toward Jonah with naked hatred. "This was my life," he said. Jonah did not lower his eyes. "No," he answered. "It was everyone else's." For once, the man in the chair was the man who belonged there. Jonah expected freedom to feel clean. It did not. He left the courthouse through a service corridor while reporters shouted Malcolm's name at doors that would not open. Vivian resigned from the case before the disciplinary board could make her. Malcolm's empire began collapsing before sentencing. Accounts froze. Partners fled. Commentators argued over whether the trial had been genius, madness, or proof that the rich believed justice was another asset class. At the hospital, Lila was awake when Jonah arrived. She was thinner, paler, and smiling around a paper cup of crushed ice. "Daddy," she whispered. He folded himself carefully around the tubes and wires and held her as if holding could stitch the world back together. For the first time in months, no one asked him to pretend to be anyone else. Celeste came 2 days later with a single suitcase and no jewelry except her wedding ring, which she removed before entering the room. Jonah saw her through the glass, hesitating as though she had no right to cross the threshold. Lila waved first. Celeste smiled, and something in Jonah's chest loosened. They did not become a family all at once. Stories that end that neatly are usually lies. They began instead with small mercies: a rented house near the rehabilitation center, breakfast at a kitchen table scarred by previous tenants. Lila learning to climb stairs again, while Celeste counted each step like a prayer. Jonah waking from nightmares in which the judge called Malcolm's name and everyone turned to him. Months later, when spring returned to Briar and the trees along the road unfolded green leaves over the ditches, Jonah received the final transfer into Lila's trust. He stared at the number for a long time. It had bought surgery, It had bought time. It had bought a future from a man who thought money could purchase innocence and discovered too late that it could also finance his undoing. That evening, Lila fell asleep on the couch between Jonah and Celeste, her hand resting over the small healing ridge beneath her shirt. Outside, rain tapped softly at the windows. Jonah looked at Celeste, and she looked back without disguise. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "who you would have been if Malcolm never found you?" Jonah watched his daughter breathe, steady and alive. "No," he said. "I know who I was. I'm trying to find out who I can be." Celeste reached for his hand. This time, when someone held on, he did not feel the weight of a bargain. He felt the fragile, frightening beginning of a life no one had paid him to live. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. You don't want to miss more stories on my channel. Don't forget to tell a friend to tell a friend. Thank you for your support.